Do you realize how hard America is working to win over Africa? Do you know what President Joe Biden and the entire US government are putting in a lot of effort to let African nations know how eagerly they want to cooperate with them? Recently, the United States organized a summit at which leaders of African nations were invited. Yet, why? The White House sought to convey to them that the United States is a superior partner to China. Would they, however, accept it? Up until now, the US has been dictating policy to African nations. Africans are deeply offended by America's view of them as people who want assistance and who should be taught what to do. Africa has now turned its back on the United States and is already moving closer to China, which is breaking news. They now favor China, but the US is still trying in vain to win back Africa. But why has Africa shunned the United States? Yes, and what is going on? Welcome back to another fantastic video. You will undoubtedly find our video fascinating if you're new to the channel and appreciate learning about modernity and its current state, particularly China's growth and rising might. In this video, we'll uncover how Africa is moving away from the United States and getting nearer to China. Let's get started. Often, facing reality is hard. However, the US has to embrace it. This time, African countries are aware enough that the US sees Africa as more of a place that should be exploited. Well, that's why several European countries and the United States itself have stayed in Africa for decades and still have influence in some African countries. Since Africa is an oil and resource-rich continent, African countries think that the US has its own interest in mind. Well, that is a reality, and that's why Africa no longer wants to have the US as its partner. It knows that the US's eyes are on the minerals, precious metals, and resources of Africa. And this time, they are ensuring that the US doesn't exploit any African countries for that. Africa has accepted Russia as its biggest arms dealer, while trade with China has grown exponentially. You might be astonished to learn that in 2021, trade between China and Africa was $257 billion, compared to just $1 billion in trade between the United States and Africa. But why is Africa approaching China? The simple truth is that Africa is aware of China as a nation that makes sure everyone wins in every agreement. Africa is aware that China prioritizes cooperation that benefits both parties, in contrast to the United States, which keeps all the profits and does little to support the nations who provide the resources. Because of this, China doesn't use Africa as a market to sell all of its goods. Instead, China imports a variety of goods from Africa. And because of this, China bought items worth $100 billion this year, a startling 43.5% increase. Tell us, are you enjoying the video? Before we go any further, if so, kindly hit the like button, spread the word, and subscribe to our channel to see more content on China's rise to power and global impact. Let's move on now. There is also another factor as well. Africa is aware that China will maintain positive relations with Africa regardless of its leadership. China will make it certain that all the deals and cooperation between all African countries and China are long-lasting. However, the matter is different in the US. Every president and every US government handpicks which country and continent they would focus on exploiting when the US feels the need to use Africa's resources. It spreads the news that Africa needs help and the US will provide it. However, the case is exactly the opposite. The US needs help from Africa. That's what the former African Union representative to the US, Arikana Chihombori-Quao, pointed out. She said that the US feels African people are in need and they should be told what to do, which just is not right. That's how the country deals with inferiors. She emphasized that the US needs to treat Africa with respect and consider it equal to itself. Only then talks and cooperations are possible. She said that during her tenure as African Union representative, she had already mentioned that the US was losing ground. She said now that the US should think that the game has changed and so have the rules. Now the US should strategize and come towards Africa with a different approach. Gone are the times when Africa had to accept whatever was thrown towards it. Now, all dealings would be done on equal grounds. If this does not happen, as it's visible, China will start to fill the space the US is leaving in Africa. When Africa is given two choices, it won't take long to choose China as its partner for simple reasons. China considers Africa an equal partner, and there is nothing wrong with that at all. The US's approach towards Africa carries a sense of superiority, which creates resentment among African leaders. The US sets agendas and policies for African countries without considering their individual needs and perspectives. This lack of respect and individual treatment contributes to the deteriorating cooperation between African countries and the US. Arikana Chihomburi Koao highlighted the disrespect inherent in this dynamic and questioned why the US should have the authority to dictate agendas and policies in Africa. The recent summit hosted by the US for African countries as leaders reflects a collective approach towards Africa, indicating a lack of individual understanding and respect. In contrast, China prioritizes cooperation, trade, and building strong relationships. At a conference between China and African countries, all participants were given equal opportunity to express their desires, and a trade cooperation agenda was set. Now, even if China is the biggest economy compared to the African countries, it still follows principles. That's how cooperation is sustained. However, the US still lives in the past where it thinks the same rigid attitude will work. She said that she was sorry, but this summit hosted by the US won't work. It won't work until the US calls every African country to the table and involves them all, setting agendas that secure each country's interests. Only then can any summit reach practical results. Listen to what Arikana Cambridge Wayo said. Essentially, the United States and Europe did it. I used to repeat it all the time during my tenure. What really lies behind the failure of effective engagement with Africa is the disrespect of Africans. That's where the problem begins. If the US cannot accept Africans as equal partners, if the United States, for example, let's look at this particular meeting, this particular circuit, there was no defined agenda. There have never been defined agendas whenever they meet with African countries as individual countries. It's always the United States setting the agenda, setting policies, and telling Africans about the policies. That is no way to have any meaningful engagement. If you take, for example, the first pocket meeting that was held between China and African heads of state, way in advance, the issues were clearly defined. The agenda was going to focus on trade, aid, and investments. The African heads of state were engaged in a discussion, planning and clearly defining the outcomes with a way forward. In terms of follow-up, it was a fruitful meeting that addressed the issues that need to be addressed, not only between African countries individually with China, but also actively involving Africans with China. There is no public agenda. There are no issues that have been presented to the African heads of states. Africans have not been asked to engage in terms of creating the agenda and ensuring that when the African heads of state come to Washington, the outcomes and issues to be discussed are meaningful, with follow-up and deliverables that are beneficial to both parties. It remains a one-sided conversation, with the United States telling Africans the agendas and policies. The Africans are not at the table to discuss issues pertaining to them. We will realize the problem, and the reason that continues to be the case, what underscores that, is the disrespect for Africans. I repeated, I tried, I complained about it repeatedly. It is a serious problem. The United States must understand that Africans are not going to take it anymore. If you don't treat Africans as equals, the failing United States is going to see itself slowly losing ground to China, to Russia and all other nations. Because without respecting Africans, without treating Africans as equal, without understanding that the exploitation and abuse of Africa simply cannot continue, this meeting, this summit, is going to be yet another futile event with no outcomes, no deliverables until the next summit. I'm sorry, but the disrespect of Africans is at the bottom of, the agenda of this meeting. The agenda should have been set out in advance. Africa should have been involved. Without the involvement of Africans in these discussions, it's useless. I'm sorry, but that is a fact. The principles the United States doesn't follow are the basics for China whenever it deals with any other country. Simply said, China is attracting African nations because, to its reputation, African leaders don't harbor any grudges and are not concerned about being stung by Chinese leaders. No matter what project, trade or agreement is in question, no hidden responsibilities are left on African countries. And it's effective. After years of expanding trade and countless initiatives, the African nations have now evaluated China's credibility. China has now been named Africa's most reliable bilateral partner. Not only is this worrying for the United States, but it's also a nightmare. According to a survey done in Africa, 76% of African youth see China as a foreign force that would shape the continent's destiny. They didn't mention the United States, which reveals what the continent's future leaders believe. How do you feel? Will the United States alter its behavior and treat every African nation equally and with importance? Do you believe that even if the US accomplishes this, African leaders will be aware of what the US leaders are thinking? Will someone notice that? In Africa and in every other continent, China has taken the position of the United States. Please leave a comment in the space provided below. How can the United States gain ground in Africa again? Would you like to see more films like this one? If so, do so that you can receive unique videos about how rapidly China is developing by liking, sharing and subscribing to the channel. Keep watching until the next video.